core gameplay loops. This one is really important for me too, because right now I'm working on my tower defense game and we are working on core gameplay loops, whether that be abilities that get unlocked through the skill tree or whether that be unlocking new champions as you reach higher and higher rounds up to a point where you can't get any more champions because you have unlocked them. And so the core gameplay loop is none of that actually. The core gameplay loop is what you do the entire time when you play this game. I make a tower defense game, that means I'm fighting enemies. Core gameplay loop is to uninstall and refund the game. Okay, bro. Shut the f up, man. So the core gameplay loop that I'm working on is how can I make attacking enemies as fun as possible and upgrading my units as fun as possible. Right now we have a very simple loop where, you know, this guy swings his sword, he generates some money as he kills enemies, and then that money can be used to get better items. And these items are unlocked throughout the game. And so the core gameplay loop in a tower defense game obviously is to generate money and to spend that money on upgrading your character. And of course the character getting stronger by investing into the character, not only through items in this case, but also through abilities. And so I have a couple of abilities in a really cool skill tree right here. And the best one that we have made so far is the projectile path. And so what I'm working on is ironing out this part right here. What you do essentially, if you have already unlocked all of the abilities, if you're starting out for the first time, how interesting does it feel? How interesting is this part of the game? What the player does constantly. Because right now I don't need to do anything essentially, right? Is that good? Is that bad? These questions need to be asked, but they can only be answered for real if I put out the game. In my case, I need to put out the game and see how long people play. There's a time on Steam that gets tracked how long people play, let's say, a demo version of your game, and then you can use that time to figure out how long people have played and whether you need to improve upon your game or, well, you always need to improve, right? But if you're going in the right direction. So what we have here is essentially I have a Cakez demo on Steam, and I'm not going to link it because it's a really bad one, but we can see here, which is the very important stat that you can use to determine whether your game is good or not. And in my case, the game's not good. There's a median time played for my game, and everyone that played my game, we have 281 players over the course of the demo, which is about 2 years almost. It's been out for a long time. I've been working on this game for a very, very long time. You can see a detailed breakdown right here, where the most players, the vast majority of players have played for 10 minutes or less. And there's a really cool graph here at the bottom that you can use to track, well, how many players have played for how long. You can see that there are 6 players that played between 17 and 80 minutes. But the majority of players spend time here. And so that's so many players that I'm missing. I also have this right here. You can't see it. Let me see. There is 17 players that played my game for 200 plus minutes. That's cool. That's actually really nice. That's a good sign. But this is bad. So, and to give you an example of what is good, we can go to Vampire Survivors. We can search for the median playtime of Vampire Survivors. There's a very cool website called Video Game Insights, and it looks like this is laggy sometimes, and so it takes a lot of time to load this. But here you can see the average and median playtime. And in comparison to a very, very successful game that has a median playtime of 18 hours, well, guess what? 8 minutes is bad. Even 1 hour is bad. 2 hours is more getting into it. But 10 minutes, really bad. And so there's a lot of things. If you make a game like that, you know that you've got work to do. And so I've got work to do. Which is why I've been working on my game for 2 years now. But this guy has been very insightful last time we watched him. He talked about game dev caution. How AAA is more cautious than experimentative, if you want to say it that way, where they try to shy away from actually making something risky and more lean towards making something that's already proven to work. And so now, what is his game on gameplay loops, core gameplay loops, and what can we learn from him? He's made the original Fallout, and let's see, design pillars.
Hi everybody, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about core game loops. This is something that's absolutely fundamental to game development. I'm incredibly embarrassed that I've had this channel for more than a year and I've never talked about this. And I bring that up because it's so fundamental, I don't even think about it. I've mentioned this a few times about other
So this is actually what I'm learning, and you want to know what a core gameplay loop actually is for a game that we have looked at recently that was very successful. Do you know what the core gameplay loop of this game is? I'll show you. You can see this in 5 seconds. The core gameplay loop of this game is mining and vision. And this is where you need to spend most of your time on. You need to first identify the core gameplay loop of your game. What are people doing constantly and how can you make this feel really good? That's what essentially he's talking about. And if you have never done this before, then obviously it will be difficult to identify, and maybe you're working on the wrong things. Like, for example, working on UI for the 10,000th time, you know? Like I do. I keep working on UI when I do this.
Things that it doesn't occur to me to talk about certain things because it's just so like endemic to the process, and I've been doing it for so long. It doesn't even occur to me that this is something I should mention. But I was looking at something online and they were talking about core game loops, and I'm like, oh my goodness, I have not even mentioned core game loops. So let's talk about this, because this is a core game loop. If you're a designer, you're going to be thinking in terms of this. You're going to be writing it up almost immediately when you make a game. If you're a programmer, unless you're a specialist, like a network programmer or maybe just doing UI, you're going to spend much of your time on core game loop code.
So, like, to give an example, I think we worked on the core gameplay loop today by implementing this sting ability and making it feel very good. I made it a very high damage ability that is single target only, and it inflicts a lot of bleed. It's supposed to deal a lot of damage. I think the upgrade progression part is part of the core loop. So essentially in my game, the core gameplay loop is not this, and I always get tricked into this stuff. What I worked on here, and I think you guys are right, this is juicing up something existing in the game, making it feel really good. But it's not the core gameplay loop. The core gameplay loop is starting a mission, doing all of the rounds, or maybe failing to do all of the rounds. You know, maybe you lose. Gaining money, gaining experience points, and then going on a new mission. Spending points here maybe. That's the core gameplay loop for a tower defense game like this. Right, so that's the core gameplay loop. I always confuse this. For me, this is the hardest part. Let's see, maybe he has some tips. Okay, please. I need tips.
So let's talk about it. What is the core game loop?
Yeah.
The core game loop is the set of actions in a game that most players will spend most of their time doing. You can think of it as, what are the most frequent and repeated actions that players take in your game?
Okay. Example.
I'm going to talk about how these are identified and why you need to identify it, because, like I said, I should have done this as the first video I ever made.
True.
Some games, it's very easy to determine the core game loop.
Yeah.
Most side-scrollers, especially the really simple side-scrollers, their core game loop is very easy to describe. You run to the right, jumping and shooting to progress through the level, to grab treasure, and to kill enemies.
True.
By the way, when you finish the level, your bonus is based on
time and pickups.
How long it took you to do it.
True.
There's the core game loop.
Yeah.
Now, RPGs can be a lot more complex than that.
RPGs, I think, like, let's talk about RPG like Skyrim. So, like, I love RPGs. We're gonna make an RPG in the future. RPGs, in my opinion, is progression in terms of skilling your character, making them stronger, items, and maybe conversations with NPCs, like more notoriety in a camp or in like a city, something like that.
Obviously, because there's a lot more actions that players can take, and defining what the typical player is can be really hard. So let's pop up for a second and just talk about let's say we're talking about fantasy games.
Yeah.
Fantasy games can have massively different core game loops.
Okay.
And now notice I didn't say RPGs. I just mean like 2 fantasy games. The core game loops can be wildly different. Some fantasy games, their core game loop may be entirely focused on combat. The whole point of it. Maybe it's a fantasy tactical combat game.
Interesting.
Everything about their core game loop is combat. It is.
So it's probably your actions you do in combat, how you press the buttons, in which order you press the buttons, and how fast maybe you can mash the buttons sometimes, and how you move. Okay.
Is selecting the units you want to have in that combat. It is doing the combat, selecting the individual actions that each unit takes.
Or like
combat.
in StarCraft.
This is everything about this is combat. But you might have another fantasy RPG or fantasy game, I should say.
I shouldn't have said StarCraft, because StarCraft is all about economy as well and multitasking. So like, but the unit control of StarCraft, if you were to take away the macro game,
where it's all about exploration. A lot of games have come out that are like this, where you're really just exploring a world. You're not really
Starfield.
fighting. You're not really even talking to anything.
Yeah.
You're just running around the world. Maybe it's just to have fun and explore. Maybe there's a story being told visually, but it's the exploration that's important. And then again, you may make a fantasy game, where most of the action is really conversation. There's a story, but it unfolds as you talk to NPCs, as you read books, as you look at computer terminals.
But then that's a very slow game, a very narrative-driven game. Yeah, these can work, but they're very relaxing.
These are narrative games that are telling their story primarily through a narrative. They maybe some of them have exploration components. Maybe they're linear, and there isn't an exploration component. The reason I wanted to bring that up is you can see that just saying fantasy game doesn't tell you what the core game loop. They can be wildly different in all these games. Now, on my games, it's even harder because the core game loop depends on the player's build.
Aha.
I may make a game.
That's my game, isn't it? Isn't that my game, guys? It depends on the player's build. Huh? I mean, you could go anywhere, It's not done yet, but you could go anywhere. Make this more powerful, And maybe you go for this ability and then bloop, bloop, bloop. And they have these items right here, bloop. Oh, now this guy does more damage and knockback and stuff. It depends on the player's build. Maybe the core gameplay loop for my game is not... Like, the second part is, going on the level and then finishing the level. But the number one part is finding cool combinations between abilities and items. And testing out these things. Having builds doesn't necessarily mean that varies your game loop. I think it means more from an RP standpoint. You're talking about gameplay mechanics. Yeah, but the core gameplay loop is, I guess, figuring out new builds between the levels. We're not always doing the same thing.
Where I expect all the players may have to do combat occasionally. Some players will do it a lot. All players have to do dialogue occasionally. Some players may do it a lot. All the players have to do stealth occasionally. Some players will do it a lot. And because these characters are...
He's talking about RPG
can be
games
mutually
too.
exclusive. There is no one...
So, for example, I played Dishonored, the very first game. Really, really good game, by the way. And I played this stealth only. I made a point to always do all the missions with maximum stealth. I never wanted to be seen. That was so cool.
Action in the core game loop that I can say all the players do. But when you group all them together, you can say most players will do most of these most of the time. Now, if you're trying to learn what a core game loop is.
Yeah, we are.
I can tell you don't have to play an entire game from start to finish to know what its core game loop is.
Yeah.
Usually you can pick up a game, play it for an hour, and you can probably pretty accurately define its core game loop.
Black Myth Wukong. Guys, Black Myth Wukong. combat-focused core gameplay loop. The actions you do in combat. Attacking, dodging, stances, timing your strong attacks, transforming, story-driven combat. Yeah, story-driven combat. The core gameplay loop is finding a bit of story, listening to the story, and then having cool combat in between. And like the ratio between story and combat is like, let's say 20% story, 80% combat. That's how I see it. Exploration, not so much because it's linear so far. I've been only in Act 1. We finished that yesterday, sorry. We finished Act 1 yesterday. And so far it was very linear. There was no exploration really going on.
If it's a good game, this is why some games fail, I think, is because they don't have a well-defined core game loop, and you can play for an hour and you're like, I still don't know what's going on.
Yeah. So this is why I try to learn this so much. This is why I'm trying to pick so many, and that's why I ask all of these questions, because I want to have a very well-defined core gameplay loop, and I want to make that as fun as possible. And I think for me, that will be the resource management and the different builds. I think that's what you're ultimately working on the most in the game. It's like in Path of Exile. You know, those Path of Building warriors. I think that's what will make my game. Most people will spend time there. That's how I see it. Maybe
alternatively, you could just play a demo. The whole point of a demo is to express the core game loop. And by the way, if you're making a vertical slice, you should also be thinking core game loop, because that's what you're trying to express. Not just here's a visual example of the game, but I've got enough of the core game loop in there that you understand what the game's going to be like when you play it.
See, this is why I have not brought out my demo version yet. Because I don't have that yet. I don't have the items. I don't have the abilities. I don't have that nice way of some items buff this ability, but also the other ability. And then it gives you this, like these incredible options. I still work on that. And once I have that, guys, there will be a demo version. I promise. 100%.
Enough vertical slices, it's not enough for them just to be pretty. They have to instantiate the core game loop.
Yeah. True.
A lot of times I've noticed that if you just watch a streamer play the game, that's enough for you to figure out the core game loop.
Yeah.
Just watch them for an hour and you'll see what they're doing over and over and over again. Are they jumping? Are they sneaking around? Are they hacking terminals? What seems to be the thing that they do the most? That's the core game loop. Let me make a big distinguish here between core game loops and design pillars. I have a whole video on design pillars and I'll link it below. They are not the same thing.
Okay.
The design pillars are there to explain how every feature that you've selected to be in the game serves those pillars. But a core game loop is you saying, okay, of all those features that we've put in the game that serve the design pillars, these are the ones I expect most of the players to experience most of the time. And there's a difference there, because you may have things that you put in. Like, let's say you put in reactivity. That's something I love putting in my game.
I see. This is a somewhat meta progression type system, which is not done at all. But we have one interesting part here, which increases the spawn rate of all enemies by 20%. This is something that's probably a design pillar in my game, which I want to have in the game for sure. Meta progression, something to get outside of the level, and maybe more. Maybe consumables, but for the most part, players will not spend a lot of time with this or engage with this a lot. Maybe a little bit, sometimes, respec, maybe not. And then for the most part, they will do something else. I think this is a design pillar.
Reactivity might be a design pillar, which means when you put in features, you're going to always ask the question of, how does what the player does when they interact with this feature, come back to them? How are they being told, hey, here's how good you're doing with this thing?
Okay. That could be stats in like a tower defense game, the same way that Vampire Survivors tracks your stats when you do a level, how much damage each different ability did. That could be something that I would need to do too, depending on how the builds work out in the future. But I already plan on doing that. That would be another design pillar to serve the purpose of, oh, your build did very well. This character was rocking it. That's how I see it.
Game loop would be those features that the player does a lot. You would expect all of them to have large amounts of reactivity. Because if this is what the player is doing most of the time, it better be supporting that design pillar of reactivity.
Yeah. So, for example, I make a cool build, and then I track how much damage each of these abilities do, percentage-wise, from total damage. Now the player gets incentivized to tweak the build even further to make it deal maybe even more damage. I think that's another pillar.
Because I've talked about you can
Nice.
occasionally have a feature that doesn't support all the design pillars. Like you may put something in that if humor is one of your design pillars, you may have something in the game that's not that funny as long as overall the game is funny. But for your core game loop, it should probably touch on all your pillars because these features are what the players.
Yes, it should touch on your pillars. Let that sink in for a while, okay, bruv?
Doing a lot. It should
Just the tip.
have a basis in those design pillars. So at this point, you should probably know why you want to define this, but let's dive into that.
Yeah.
Your core game loop tells your entire team what to focus on. Because here are the features of this big design document. Here are the features that are the most important to get correct, to get in early, to get them correct. It will help you. It'll help the production staff decide what to prioritize.
For me, and I'm pretty sure for any other game developer that has very little experience making, finishing, and then publishing a big game with a lot of features, a game design document can be very difficult, in my opinion, because you might think you have something here, then you go to implement it, and it doesn't work out at all. And now the entire game design document that you wrote is in the trash bin, and you have to go back to the drawing board. I don't know, maybe there should be like a shorter version for people that are just starting out, for things they want in the game, but to define them more loosely so that it is easier for them to not spend too much time on this rigid document. But maybe that is just a preference, and I experience that differently than others because I've been making games for about 4 years now. I've started learning C++ first, and for 3 years I've been working on my one big game, and I've made small games in the meantime whenever I needed some space from my game. So I think I've made about 6 to 7 games at this point. Not all of them finished, of course, but some of them have like a really reasonably well-defined gameplay loop, and you can play them from start to finish. And for me, oftentimes the design pillars, unless I'm already making a game that I know what type of game I make and it already exists, I don't know what to put in there, and it changes all the time. The game design documents are important when working in a group, not necessarily when working solo. That's also a big part. I'm working solo, and so that could mean that I have a different view on this. Exactly, you're right, AQ.
Because when there are features that have to be done, you're like, well, these are part of the core game loop. They have to be done. You could have a fun, it's like side quests. If you have to drop a side quest because you run out of time, that's okay because it's not part of the main story.
Yeah, true.
Your features help you schedule in the same way. This is a great feature. It's fun.
Yeah, in a team that makes much more sense, what he's saying here, yeah.
But is it part of the core game loop? And if it's not, it can go.
The core gameplay loop is pressing the refund button. You're gone for 5 minutes, bro. Think about what you said, okay? You will not refund my game because it's going to be awesome. Just
You
wait.
may not want it to go,
Just
but
wait.
it can go. Similarly, when you get to the end of the game, this tells you where to spend a lot of your time optimizing. Because if core game loop features, like I said, it's where most players spend most of their time. You want that to be optimized. You want a smooth UI experience. You want a good frame rate.
Did he just say smooth UI? Did he just say a smooth UI? Ooh, take a look at this, boys. Ooh, look at this. Let me spawn this tangerine right here, Blum. Oh, target priority at the top. Abilities here. I think that's smooth. Buttery UI, yeah. Taking everything literally. Yeah, of course, bruh. I think I'm going the right way, guys.
You want to make sure that there are no bugs in that core game loop because that's what
True, we had so many bugs. Ooh, yeah. We're still
most of
ironing
your
them
players
out.
are going to spend most of their time doing.
Yep.
If there's an occasional bug that occurs from some obscure thing that the player can maybe do, like maybe if they craft one item at a particular table and give it to a particular NPC and it causes that NPC to go in a bad state, you want to fix that. But if you had to prioritize that bug against, oh yeah, if you ever shoot a gun at an NPC that has more than 5 hit points, sometimes the game crashes.
Okay, I get it, yeah.
So,
Smart.
another reason you want to make your core game loops, you want to define it as early as you can in your design docs, is publishers will want to see them. They frequently ask to see them.
Okay, we don't work with publishers here. We're publishing our own game, okay? Can we do it better? No, absolutely not. But yeah, I don't want to give away money to a publisher, okay? I watched a Pirate Software short that said publishers are... what's it called? I think it said publishers are sharks or vampire. Actually, no. It said publishers are vampires. Okay, I believe him. So I'm not going to get any publisher. No, publishers pain in the ass.
And it's what the publisher will judge all of your game content against. If they see you saying your core game loop is this, and then your game seems to be filled with a bunch of features and content that aren't part of the core game loop, they're going to ask you why it's there.
Mm-hmm.
But, and I'll tell you this, there's another reason for you to make sure the core game loop is defined early.
So you know what to work on.
You want publishers, or whoever's giving you money, to see that core game loop. It is a great way to provide context for answers to your questions when they have questions about it. So if, for example, you have a publisher going, well, we really like microtransactions. A great way to respond to that if you don't want them is like, we don't see a role for microtransactions in this game's core game loop. And the reason that's a nice way of phrasing it is either they have to figure out how microtransactions would fit in that core game loop, which they're probably not going to be able to do, or they're going to have to ask you to change the core game loop, which your response would be, that's the core game loop. So you want me to change the entire game. So we're going to throw away this, we're going to throw away these things, because if microtransactions
corporate speak,
are part of the core game
this
loop,
is more corporate stuff.
we're going to redesign.
Doesn't apply to us.
It is a nice defense against some of the things that publishers will ask you to add. But because if it's not part of the
that's why you don't work with them.
I don't see a lot of players
They're
doing
vampires.
this, and I certainly don't see a lot of players doing this a lot.
Mm-hmm.
You can often get suggested features, either deprioritized or not considered altogether. One last thing about core game loop.
Okay.
And I'm saying this from experience. The bigger your core game loop, the longer it takes you to write it down, the more features that are part of it, the harder that game loop will be to implement.
Oh God, shut.
I say this from experience because when I make games that I say I want people to be able to play them all these different ways.
No, that's what happened to
fight
me,
through it
man.
and stealth through it and go through primarily with companion support. That just added a lot of work.
Sorry,
I say this from experience because when I make games that I say I want people to be able to play them all these different ways. I want them to talk through it and fight through it and stealth through it and go through primarily with companion support. That just added a lot of work and time to your schedule. Because if that's...
Guys, if you ever make a tower defense game, okay? If you ever make a tower defense game, please do me a favor, okay? Don't make physical fire, ice, cold, and lightning damage. What? Make one type of damage and HP.
The core game loop that you expect most of the players to be doing, it's got to be good.
Oh, yeah.
And of course, like I've always said, that then translates to a big core game loop will translate into a big schedule, which will translate into a big team and a lot of money. So
time.
It's in your best
For me, it's time, aka money. Yeah, true.
To try to get your core game loop as laser focused as possible, but understand that some games will have big core game loops. It's just always in your best interest. It's in your best interest. It's in your team's best interest for knowing what they should work on. And it's in the publisher's best interest for knowing what game they're buying and how you're going to respond to suggestions to change it. It's in everybody's best interest to get that core game loop defined as early and as specifically as you can. I hope this helps.
Thank you. Thank you very much, mister. I really do. Yes, it was very helpful. That is really, 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 really interesting. And he's right with everything he says. Really good video. It was very helpful for me. And I probably have to rewatch this multiple times. It will take some time to get used to understanding what is your core gameplay loop and how to make it better.